Welcome to History 354, Modern China. Today is the fateful lesson where we dive into one of the greatest tragedies in human history, the Great Leap Forward. To get there, we have to start with a prior episode known as the 100 Flowers Movement and a subsequent anti-rightist campaign that came right on its heels. In classic Chinese history, there were instances of what's called yanlu, criticism encouraged by emperors to facilitate a spirited debate of the ruling regime's policies and historical record. The roots of the 100 Flowers, which was kind of similar to those periods, can be traced to an internal debate within the Politburo, the upper echelon of the Chinese Communist Party, where on one side you had Mao Zedong and his supporters, who were confident that the success of the party in that golden age we talked about last week had won them the undying loyalty of the educated classes and had made intellectuals, even those that stood outside the party, sufficiently read where they could be allowed a freer space to kind of go over the record of communism and its achievements and offer insights and ideas about how to move the nation forward. Mao, in launching this 100 Flowers and encouraging intellectual debate and new schools of thought to flourish, referenced a kind of golden age in Chinese history, a warring states period when many different traditions, such as Confucianism and Taoism, were formed and helped in the formation of strong, powerful states and institutions that would come to have a lasting legacy in Chinese history, referencing this kind of let 100 flowers bloom, let 100 schools of thought contend. The idea that the Chinese Communist Party feared no criticism and scrutiny of its record and would stand on its own and live up to any kind of pressure that intellectual classes could put on the state to perform and also to advance the interests of the nation. From all accounts, then, Mao was shocked, surprised that so many intellectuals not only questioned the government's style of rule, but also its efficacy and decision-making. The retaliation that was then launched in an anti-rightist campaign was swift and severe. Between 300,000 to 700,000 highly talented individuals were given the devastating title of rightists during this campaign in 1957, and they were sufficiently labeled enemies of the people. The two groups that were particularly hard hit as targets of the anti-rightist campaign that came in the wake of the 100 Flowers were patriotic liberals, people who weren't members of the Communist Party. Many of them had been educated abroad and returned to New China after 1949, and they were inspired and willing to help the government as administrators, civil servants, or to offer their talents in the fields such as science, architecture, and new technologies to the party. Another group were the so-called outside cadres, members of the Chinese Communist Party who had actually been sent to free China before the revolution. There, they gained experience as civil servants, but their distance from the violent liberation, armed struggle, and land reform that took place in the North meant that they also believed communism's primary goal was to emancipate the people to pursue their own ambitions, not, as Mao and the other elites within the CCP now believed, to use propaganda, class struggle, indoctrination to remold the Chinese people into something new and different altogether. The effect was to narrow arts and politics to a matter of performing conformity with the party's ideology, abandoning a chance to make communism accountable to the people and their interests. That's really what was lost here in 1957 and 1958 when the 100 Flowers movement scared Mao and the Chinese Communist Party that actually there were so many people opposed to their revolution that they might still lose control over the country. The anti-rightist campaigns satisfied the desires of the new ranks, rising from peasants, workers, and lowly backgrounds that were less educated and accomplished than many of the people labeled rightists. It fed a kind of anti-intellectualism within Chinese society that wanted to destroy the old tradition of venerating elites and the educated classes and seeing them as noble and virtuous. The attacks by the public, led by Mao and the party, were vengeful, and it marked a turning point in the great helmsman, Mao's career, when he became contemptuous of intellectuals, distrustful of the very nature of higher learning and art as something that was inherently anti-revolutionary and conservative. He had lost faith in trusting them, in opposing many people within the party who said that he shouldn't encourage 100 flowers to bloom. And so he inflicted upon them, the intellectuals, publicly the humiliation that he felt on the inside and within the inner ranks of the Chinese Communist Party. In stark contrast to dynastic China, then it was the common people and people from the lowliest background after this anti-rightist campaign that were believed to be the fount of wisdom and true knowledge, and only their progeny could lead the nation into its bright future. In later years, Mao would utter speeches denouncing intellectuals as the most ignorant and the most wasteful class, and he would talk about their love for technology and Western science as a trivial fetish compared to harnessing the awesome willpower and determination of the masses as a force for growth and development. A second really enormous consequence felt later in the Great Leap Forward was to deprive the nation of the very type of people, technicians, scientists, economists, professionals, that were necessary to make the industrial jump ahead. They were already in short supply of these people, and the labeling of so many of them as rightists meant a loss of very capable administrators and people of merit that could have actually mitigated a lot of the damages done by this program for industrialization. So let's get there. Let's jump right into what goes wrong with the Great Leap Forward. The origins of the Great Leap Forward lie in a recognition in the Chinese Communist Party in the late 1950s that actually the Soviet model for growth was really ill-suited to China because of the factors that we mentioned last time. In 1950, China was already 4 times as large as the Soviet Union had been in the 1920s when it began its industrial development under communism. And the standard of living for most people in China was only half as high in terms of material wealth. Grain production, which had been a modest success in the 1950s, was not keeping pace with population growth and urbanization, which was happening very rapidly. Worse, the Soviet loans in the late 1950s were now coming due, and they required the export of agricultural products, a crunch that was compounded by rising unemployment in urban areas. The way out of this, led by economists, was to pursue a very gradual, somewhat painful solution. They were to slow the rate of investment in heavy industry, already around 48% of the state's revenues. And instead, the government should move capital to light industry to create consumer goods that hopefully would incentivize entrepreneurs and peasants to work in teams and create a kind of agricultural revolution that we see in Great Britain. Central ministries and planners would have a huge role in overseeing this growth and offering rewards and subsidies for it. But this slow approach also infuriated Mao. It was bad politics, even though it was sound economics. He convinced the rest of the party that such a stage could be bypassed through a massive organization of rural labor, using ideology and great amounts of self-sacrifice on the part of the Chinese people. These assumptions become more understandable if we think about how the party's recent identity was formed in the context of guerrilla warfare in northern China. Indeed, much of the party's rhetoric in the 1950s was infused with a warlike mentality, where campaigns, speeches, and slogans on posters, like as seen here, framed the nation's goals using military terminology. To achieve industrial growth, whole regiments of farmers were marched into the fields in actual military formation with drums and flags like they were marching off into the battlefront. And like the war in the north, the entire economic plan relied on the strength of a total mobilization of peasants for labor at new projects and round-the-clock teams, or what Mao called in his plan walking on 2 legs. Essentially, walking on 2 legs meant 1, decentralization of the economy and its plans to the local level, and second, a massive application of human muscle power to increase productivity. Rural labor would be sent out in teams to irrigate, repair dikes, and reclaim new lands. This was perhaps the only and most successful area of the Great Leap Forward. Through tireless work of some 650 million Chinese commoners, new roads, factories, lakes, fields, and even cities were built and erected from scratch. A second dimension was to increase agricultural productivity by just simply throwing more and more laborers at fields. Out into the fields, they used the simple formula of just planting more seed than ever before and working harder and longer hours at more and more strenuous work to protect these seeds with their hands, to weed and take other measures to nurture and cultivate these crops. The last dimension was to make small-scale industry with materials at hand in the countryside, what they could find or procure from their own hands and homes, and somehow actually turn this into industrial products. The most famous example from the Great Leap Forward that historians reference of this type of work came from the creation of millions of small backyard furnaces, where people would melt down scrap metal that they found in their buttons, in small knives, by smashing iron pots and cookware and pans, and also door handles, all in the hopes of melting this down and refurnishing it into high-grade industrial quality steel. By the end of 1958, over 1 million backyard furnaces had been built across China, and the country was employing the work of 100 million people in nearly 24-hour shifts in the countryside to produce this. Without special guidance, equipment, or much knowledge of how to do this, much of what they produced in those furnaces was entirely worthless. Worse, it actually took things that were valuable, such as door handles or things like cooking pots, and made them into absolute garbage. Mao's faith in these labor-intensive solutions to China's challenges in the late 1950s was also illustrated by public health campaigns to eradicate things like snail fever, also known as bilharzia or schistosomiasis. Snail fever is a waterborne disease caused by a parasite that has a terrible effect on human health. The parasites thrive in manure close to water where thousands of eggs hatch and then later burrow into the skin of mammals such as oxen, water buffalo, and unfortunately humans. Much like malaria, many people react with a high fever, leading to death in just a few days. Others live on for decades, but with constant fatigue, diarrhea, and chronic abdominal pain. Today, over 200,000 people die annually around the world, and another 243 million people are infected with this disease in 86 countries. Snail fever, though, has been a plague on society in China going back centuries. In 1949, it was endemic in 11 provinces and Taiwan, spread across thousands of miles of canals, rivers, and lakes. Around 10 million people in that time were infected, another 100 million were at risk, and on average 400,000 people in China died each year from the disease. Corpses unearthed from the Han Dynasty also show evidence that snail fever has a history dating back to the Han Dynasty, 2,000 years ago, and records from the Sui show that Chinese academics and physicians had already named it Gubing and were theorizing that it could be traced back to water and to diseases related to poor public sanitation. In the early 20th century, leading international physicians from the US, Great Britain, and Japan, along with China's leading scientists at Peking Union Medical College and the Shanghai Institute of Natural Science, began to study snail fever and develop plans for its prevention and treatment. Conversely, despite the combined efforts of medical missionaries, foreign researchers, and private institutions, little was actually done to stamp out the disease in Republican China. But from them, the Chinese Communist Party inherited a concrete description of the life cycle of the parasite that caused snail fever and plans for how to prevent its spread and treat its victims. Once in power, Mao and the CCP in 1949 immediately started campaigns against snail fever, and then launched much greater, more intensive campaigns in 1957 and 1958, and again during the Cultural Revolution. This was no coincidence. It reflected Mao's belief that public health was a perfect example of the power, but also the superiority of the mass line, that locals provided support and encouragement of the party could surpass the achievements of professional scientists, physicians, and engineers. He believed in order to succeed, one must be read and expert, and that it was easier for commoners to become an expert than for intellectuals at this point, following his heartbreak with the 100 Flowers movement, for them to actually be authentically read or communist. So then rather than search for a cure or focus on complex biomedical solutions for treatment, he thought the disease could be eradicated by grassroots prevention efforts, sending teams to hunt down and suffocate millions of snails, or patriotic education, where villagers were taught basic hygiene and not to defecate near water supplies because it would make China stronger, more modern, and more powerful in the future. And I'm going to have to stop my video here and continue on. I have about 10 more minutes to finish in the second video.